again, thank you, Ramesh. It's an honor to join my colleagues from the Young Professional and Student Chapter of OIAC. My name is Amir Emadi. Today we have Dr. Azadeh Sami from Virginia, Behrang Borhani from California, and Seena Saidian from UC Berkeley, who I believe is in Kansas now. So to start with, all of us are inspired by the message of change that is coming from Iran's young population. And even though we haven't been to Iran, we very much see ourselves as a part of a greater call for a free Iran. And with that said, the voice of the young Iranian population is gaining momentum, and we strive to echo their message. In our panel today, we are analyzing three important topics: the latest status of the pandemic in Iran, potential shifts in US policy in 2021, and the role of the international community vis-a-vis Iran. So let me start with Dr. Sami. Over the past year, Iran has been one of the countries that's been hit the hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the international community has been kept in the dark on the true fatality rates. Could you please elaborate on the COVID-19 outbreaks in Iran?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amir. So let me begin with just some eye-opening statistics on the mortality rate of this COVID pandemic. So to date, the COVID death toll from 465 cities across Iran has surpassed 190,000 and still counting. So to put it in perspective, that's about 237 deaths per 100,000 population, compared to the second highest, which is in Brazil, which is 85 per 100,000. The regime, of course, has suppressed these statistics, just as they have suppressed mass executions and other crimes in the past. We get this information from Iran's main opposition group and their brave network inside Iran, which includes doctors and nurses. Just last week, the regime's vice chair of the National Coronavirus Combat Task Force in Tehran said the rate of spread of the COVID-19 in Tehran is still high, and we must expect the next peak. And again, last week, one of the regime's parliament deputies said, our government officials did not take the coronavirus issue seriously. The government solutions are simply not working because the regime is just unfit and unwilling to help. The mishandling of this pandemic is just one example that illustrates the regime's corruption among its other examples, such as human rights violations, export of terrorism, and the nuclear threat that the previous panels already discussed. The continued mismanagement and corruption at the highest level started with denying the existence of the virus and downplaying the seriousness of its spread. The IRGC, which was just recently designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, is in fact running the hospitals. There is utter lack of care and basic support for the medical staff. So for example, last week, we just received news about Mohammad Rezai, who was a medical assistant who worked with the COVID patients day in and day out since the outbreak. He truly provided what we would call a holistic support for his patients. And he provided emotional health support with music and dancing to just help them lift their moods up. He actually died of COVID, unfortunately, on December 8th. Why? Because the regime refuses to provide the most basic protective gears for the medical staff. The very gears, in fact, that the IRGC is actually selling in the black markets and shipping to their proxies in the region. So again, back to how corrupt this regime is. As a medical professional, I am just heartbroken to see that there's so much that can be done to help the people of Iran, but unfortunately, my colleagues there are left without much resources and support to help the people who are sick. I must add that based on the information I've received from several colleagues inside Iran, the majority of those who die from COVID are from the most deprived sector of the society. It's truly heartbreaking.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. And based on what you said, there seems to be a case of extreme corruption and mismanagement, and that is a recurring theme with this regime. So let me take a moment here and invite Seena to give us a perspective on the policy environment that's rapidly changing with the new administration. There talks about the revival of the JCPOA, Iran's nuclear deal. How do you see these moves Seena, align with the desire of the Iranian people?
Well, I want to start by making it very clear that the Iran of today is very different from the Iran of, say, 8 or 12 years ago. So the policies of the past simply aren't compatible with the Iranian people's current priorities. When we see protests and Iranians taking to the street chanting things like reformers, hardliners, the game is over, it is clear that they are tired of 4 decades of corruption and deception that has kept them down all these years. So the short answer to your question is that it would be a strategic mistake to overlook the concerns of human rights and other concerns that the Iranian people have. For the past 40 years or so, policymakers have hoped that the regime can be reformed from within if only the United States empowered the so-called moderates in Iran. Now, the problem with this approach is that this regime is fundamentally incapable of reform, as there is no such thing as a moderate theocrat. We need to remember that since day one, this regime's sole focus has been the pursuit of hegemony through a domestic and regional reign of terror. So simply put, a regime that guns down protesters by the hundreds and redirects the people's stolen wealth to its terrorist proxies cannot be treated as a rational partner. And moreover, a regime that uses mafia-style diplomacy like nuclear blackmail and hostage-taking cannot be expected to deal in good faith or to moderate its behavior anytime soon. Now, a second point that I think needs to be made is that the grievances of the Iranian people go far deeper than the nuclear program. If the uprisings of the last few years have shown us anything, it's that Iranians reject the entire existence of the theocracy. So when the United States is crafting policy, it has to remember that the biggest victim of a bad deal is the Iranian people, who are starved and suppressed while the regime uses sanctions relief to line the pockets of its loyalists in the IRGC as they wreak havoc across Iran and the Middle East, creating one disaster after another. So keeping that in mind, any new Iran policy must center the Iranian people in their demands for human rights. The changes of the past few years has made it so that the United States has a great deal of leverage in dealing with Iran. So it would be in the best interest of the next administration to take advantage of this leverage and support the Iranian demands for democratic change by placing human rights at the bedrock of US policy. Now, the good news on this front is that Congress has made it extremely clear that these are not partisan concerns or even an American issue alone. Rather, the concerns that we're talking about today are a global threat to security and democratic values. And that's why we see concerted bipartisan pushes in Congress to hold this regime accountable for its terrorism and for its human rights abuses. And these same attitudes are also present in Europe, where earlier this month, the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas noted that there needs to be a new approach to Iran that addresses human rights, missile proliferation, terrorism, and other concerns. So these reactions that we're seeing, especially recently to the execution of the journalist Ruhollah Azam, show that our European allies are beginning to place human rights at the heart of their interactions with the regime, and it's imperative that the United States does the same.
Thank you, Seena. And let's turn to Behrang. The question for you is, so how do you see the role of the international community in 2021? And more specifically, if you think that multilateralism will work?
Thank you, Amir. And actually, that's a really important question right now, especially as Seena was touching on it with the role of our European allies in a 2021 multilateral policy. As we've seen throughout history, that dictators can only be dealt with when a unified approach is being taken. And in that consideration, only a strong multilateral approach can give us the options we need to address the constant threat by the current Islamic Republic. As you know, the Iranian government regularly conducts terrorist activities all throughout the region, in many cases in Western Europe too. Instead of being held accountable for their actions, they've been able to get away with their behavior through leveraging their proxies, their embassies, and using their diplomatic immunity. But we saw a powerful shift in that in the multilateral policy just a couple of years ago when EU members joined together to foil what could have been a massive terror attack on European soil. Actually, in 2017, as I believe some of my colleagues mentioned earlier, there was a terror plot being planned and it ushered forward by Iranian diplomat Azadeh. And fortunately, countries like France and Germany joined together to sort of track down and prevent that from taking place. The attack, which was supposed to take place in the summer of 2018, was stopped thanks to that cooperation, which sheds light on just how crucial a concerted and unified policy can be, and the impact that it can have on ensuring the safety of, safety and security of innocent people both outside of Iran and also inside. This goes along with the importance of ending the notion of impunity for the Iranian government. The multilateral Iran policy in 2021 can and should make it a cornerstone of their platform to unify and holding the Islamic Republic accountable for the countless massacres they've committed. For too long, they've been able to get away with a lot of their human rights abuses and just outright massacres of their own people. And instead of that, we need to start voicing support for the Iranian people's needs and desires. For example, the atrocities which took place in 1988, where over 30,000 political prisoners were executed in just a single summer, have to this day gone without consequence. A recent Amnesty International report found that most Iranian officials that were involved at the time, or present at the time, were aware of the mass execution of these dissidents, and yet those who were responsible haven't been held accountable. In fact, some of these officials actually live in the United States and European countries, one of them being Mohammad Jafar Mahalati, who's living quite comfortably in Ohio and hasn't faced trial or any sort of consequence for his abject crimes against humanity. Legal actions in international courts and tribunals for those involved directly or indirectly in the 1988 massacre of the political prisoners, and just in last November, where the regime opened fire and killed over 1,500 peaceful protesters, many of which were women and some were children, as was documented. By holding these international courts and tribunals, we can make sure that these sort of events don't continue to take place, and that the suffering of all the Iranian prisoners that are currently still imprisoned can sort of be held accountable for. A new multilateral approach when dealing with Iran must include stances on issues such as nuclear proliferation, the regime's regional terrorism, and as many of my colleagues mentioned before, their human rights record. We can measure the success of these policies by truly listening to the message of the people inside Iran, sanctioning corrupt regime officials, voicing unequivocal support for the people's right to protest, and outright condemnation of the regime's brutal crackdowns are just a few ways we can reduce Iran's destabilizing activities in the region. A new policy in 2021 has an opportunity to rally the international community together in order to develop a truly cohesive and concerted policy of accountability, and one that's actually focused on the needs and desires of the Iranian population. Which is why, now more than ever, the age-old saying of there's strength in numbers highlights how important a multilateral, globally unified policy really is.
And that helps us understand from an international perspective. What specific policies do you think the new administration here should adopt?
So, as opposed to just the new administration, in terms of the international community as a whole, it's important for two primary goals to be accomplished in setting forth the new policy. First, the policy must ensure that the Iranian government can't continue to export terror around the region, around the world, and consequently undermine peace and stability. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, the policy must be focused on promoting the desires and basic rights of the Iranian people. I believe many of my colleagues actually touched on the importance of this policy point, because for far too long, the politicized interests have overshadowed the voices and struggles of the domestic population. Protests have gone overlooked. Violent crackdowns and human rights violations have had a blind eye turned towards them, and as a result, innocent Iranians have suffered. With this newfound opportunity to put forth a decisive and comprehensive policy toward Iran, the international community has to make it clear that diplomacy and negotiation can only be on the table so long as the interest, freedom, and security of Iranian citizens is upheld.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Behrang. Those are amazing points. So let me come back to Dr. Sami here. On the issue of COVID, so Rouhani and Zarif are claiming that the sanctions are preventing Iran from obtaining the vaccine for COVID. What's your read on that?
Yeah, so this claim is just yet another attempt by the regime to distract the world from reality. And it's absolutely a lie, as we all know that these sanctions just don't apply to medical aid or support. I mean, Germany, France, and India, and many other countries have routinely, they send medicine and medical aid all the time. So I would say that both Rouhani and Zarif are the chief officers of deception in this regime. If you recall what was going on earlier in the pandemic, on the one hand, the regime whose supreme leader happens to be sitting on $95 billion of wealth asked for lifting of economic sanctions in order to help with the supplies for the people. And on the other hand, they refused the assistance from Doctors Without Borders. So throughout this pandemic, masks and hygienic products have actually been monopolized by the regime's insiders to profit from this public health crisis. There have been videos of boxes of medical equipment being hidden in IRGC storage right before they were allocated to their terrorist proxies in the Middle East. Back in February, you may also recall that Iran donated 1 million masks to China, and there were reports of masks and other equipment being delivered to Venezuela. In addition, the regime publicly rejected COVID-related medical aid and assistance from the United States, and both Zarif and Rouhani actually bragged about how they're helping other countries. The regime downplayed the virus and social distancing guidelines to the public, all the while continuing flights to and from China well after the international community halted the flights. So the question is, how is it that a country with a revenue of $250 billion per year is leading the world in the COVID death rates? With such a revenue, how can they possibly blame other countries for the people's lack of access to healthcare or to the COVID vaccine? The regime has perpetually played the victim and blamed maximum pressure policy or sanctions for its poor COVID response. The reality is that the regime is actually now in survival mode, especially now after the deaths of Qasem Soleimani and Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. They are pouring all of their economic resources, or I should say the Iranian people's resources, into supporting their proxies in the Middle East. It is well known that the regime spends $15 billion per year on the Assad regime in Syria, $800 million on Hezbollah in Lebanon, and $150 million on Shia militias in Iraq, and $100 million on Hamas. And this is each year. And all the while they're multiplying their nuclear stockpile. So that means less resources for public health and the social well-being of Iranians. This should make it clear where their priorities lie. So this bogus claim about sanctions inhibiting the production or access to vaccines is completely baseless. The regime was never, ever vested in protecting Iranian people to begin with, not during this pandemic, and certainly not in these past 40 years.
Thank you, Dr. Sami, on that. And to re-highlight your point, it seems the regime is completely undermining the people of Iran and blaming sanctions on those problems. But moving beyond sanctions and turning back to you, Seena, how can US policy or the US empower the people of Iran?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Behrang said about international and American emphasis in terms of human rights, but I would go farther on two fronts. First of all, I would say there needs to be a very clear acknowledgement of human rights violations, whether it's things like the torture and execution of dissidents or the suppression of women or the countless other human rights violations we hear out of Iran. The United States must make it clear that we as a democratic country will not let this regime continue its brutality without scrutiny and without accountability. And furthermore, we cannot normalize diplomacy with a regime that violates every basic right that we believe in. If we don't maintain this strict commitment to human rights, there's no way we can expect the regime to take us seriously when it comes to the policy towards Iran. Second, I would say there needs to be a very clear support for the Iranian people's demands for democracy. Just this last year, in November 2019, thousands of Iranians took to the streets chanting things like "Death to Khamenei" and "Down with the regime." The regime's response to this, as we all know, was to indiscriminately murder peaceful organizers, and they also shut off internet access throughout the country so that news of their brutality couldn't be broadcast to the outside world. In such a scenario, the United States must be ready to offer technical aid and support Iranian efforts to mobilize and spread the word about what's going on in the country, around the world. And a great first step in this happened earlier in March in Senate Resolution 539, which specifically called on the US administration to facilitate uninterrupted internet access for the Iranian people. So when it comes to dealing with Iran, the United States must act first and foremost as a beacon for freedom and dignity by elevating Iranian voices when the regime tries so desperately to silence them. Luckily, as we've seen in the last few years, momentum is quickly shifting towards the Iranian people, and it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility that the next major uprising happens in the early months of the next administration. When that happens, the US must have its hands open to welcome the Iranian people and stand with them instead of being entangled in negotiations and talks with the regime, because that is the support that could very well make the difference and help the people deal their final blow to this regime.
Thank you, Seena. And turning back to Behrang, maybe you can help us conclude our segment here by summarizing the role of the international community, and more specifically, how can the international community hold the regime accountable?
Right. So along the same lines, actually, I'm glad Seena mentioned right now in terms of the United States keeping a strong and firm stance on the regime's human rights abuses. We can take that to a foreign policy level by saying that, with the United States using the multilateral policy that we've been speaking of, go to the UN and demand that international fact-finding missions to seek truth and justice about the massacres, as I mentioned, in 1988. There was one in 1999, in 2009 election uprising, and last year's November 2019 uprising. By forming international fact-finding missions, we can truly raise awareness about what happened during those years and expose the regime for those massacres. So in terms of a foreign policy perspective, it's necessary that the United States not only has a strong stance in and of itself, but then takes that even further with their European allies and sort of establish those fact-finding missions. In addition to that, America, at this point, can once again become a lead by example nation in terms of foreign policy with Iran, especially by conditioning any sort of diplomatic engagement with the Iranian regime to be a cornerstone on the release of all political prisoners, which has long been a major issue inside of Iran. A 2018 bipartisan Senate resolution stated, and I quote, the United States should work with the international community to ensure that violations of human rights are part of all formal and informal multilateral or bilateral discussions with and regarding Iran. So, it has the support of United States policymakers. And so, it's just a matter of taking it one step further and making sure that we can implement those in our foreign policy. Those are just a few of the many sort of policy points that the United States and the rest of the world need to come together in a multilateral concerted effort to really hold this regime accountable in 2021 and moving forward, to make sure that they can't continue to commit their constant human rights abuses, and that we can actually hear the voices, the desires, the needs, and uphold the basic rights of the Iranian people.
Thank you, Behrang. And let me wrap up our segment by thanking everyone on our panel, Behrang, Seena, Dr. Sami. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the topics that continue to be on top of mind for OIAC's young professionals and students.